Hey, Pat, and this is a build I honestly cannot recommend for the life of me. It's a great build, don't get me wrong. Glacial Blizzard has damage for days, control, and you can punch up really well even if you don't find the right aspects for it immediately. It is also strangely relaxing. Do you want to be like a middle manager? Just send a command, send a Blizzard over there and say, you deal with this problem while I chill in the other room? Do you want the option to dive in anyway and be dramatic? Well, the Glacial Blizzard build does that for you. It can handle mobs, it can handle bosses, but there is one gigantic problem. I am level 81, and I've only seen 3 of the most important aspects in this build. In fact, it's the one that gives it the damage and enables the build to exist. The Glacial aspect. When you cast Blizzard, it will periodically spawn exploding ice spikes that deal damage. Your ice spikes deal increased damage to frozen enemies. Now that's great. Now here's the problem with this. It is based on the item you find it on. Unlike many other aspects that do not care, those are the ones that usually give you percentages, such as expectant or conceited. But Glacial has a damage number on it, a damage number that is not modified by your weapons, skills, or whatever. It just exists in its own place. The good news is it is independently good whatever else you do. Think of it as a separate skill that rides on Blizzard. Unfortunately, that also means you need to find a glacial aspect naturally from an ancestral thing. I mean, if you want value, this is a sacred aspect that I put on an ancestral amulet. You can tell because the damage I'm actually dealing, 1014, is lower than the minimum printed on it, which is 1062. Despite that, we're doing great numbers and it will work. Just be aware that if you want to try this build, yikes. But it is a good build. It's a strong build. It's a build that feels great to play. I mean, sometimes you'll get randomly one-shot by a crossbow, but that happens. So if you're still interested, despite it being super difficult to get this to its maximum value, please listen on. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can hear more builds and whatever else I decide to do for Diablo. Also, I have a lot of shorts. You know the drill, but now the drill is going to change a little bit because now I have a link to the build in the description below and probably in the first comment. I'm going to try not to discuss every little thing about the build, but I probably will. We're going to start with aspects and then move on to skills and paragon boards. We're only going to talk about the more critical parts of the build. So if you find yourself with questions, leave them in the comments and I will answer as soon as I can, even during the weekend. Okay, for our helmet, it's the Great Helm of Disobedience. Of course, it's going to be Disobedience because we need some defense. Even though we're likely going to get one shot without our barrier, we still need to pretend that we're going to take some gentle hits. Disobedience gives you a lot more armor whenever you deal any form of damage. That includes our ice spikes, blizzard, and sometimes we spit out some ice shards, depending on the enchantment you choose. For the stats in the helm, total armor, I like cooldown reduction because while we do have a way to reset our abilities, I would prefer not to rely on that. The others, well, up to you. I do not recommend strength. I just did not have one that had int on it. Unfortunately, our second item is the Raiment of the Infinite, which is a unique that lets you improve your teleport. After you teleport, close enemies are pulled to you and stunned for 2.9 seconds or 3 seconds if you get max roll. But the cooldown of teleport is increased by 20%. That's fine because we have a lot of cooldown reduction. Unfortunately, I was originally going to bring out this video without Raiment of the Infinite because it's actually kind of hard to find, at least for me. While powerful, I would consider this item entirely optional. If you just want to get the build off the ground, you don't need it. Put on any sort of damage reduction aspect on a chest and you'll be fine. That said though, it is really good. If you make teleport your enchantment, your evade becomes a teleport and also applies the nonsense that Raiment of the Infinite applies, which can let you stun bosses really fast and let your blizzard do a lot of the work. And grouping things is nice, I guess, but don't get stuck in like, I can't make this work because the Raiment isn't there. The Raiment is an improvement on what you can do. It is not a core of the build, so don't worry about it. For our gauntlets, I chose the aspects of control because we deal more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. 3 statuses that you will deal to people as a Sorc. I just found the lucky hits on this very funny, but I would recommend that you have something with int and high crit strike chance, which I do have. Actually, you know what? It's probably just the lucky hit chance to heal that I don't like. But since we don't have a core skill, not really. Well, we do technically, but I'll explain that later. I don't really feel the need to add a core skill increase on this thing. So for the pants, it's good old Frost Blitz because it gives Frost Nova an additional charge. Frost Nova, by the way, the best damn skill on the Sorcerer bar, and I hate it for it, but whatever. The cooldown per charge is increased up to 40%, but that's fine. Honestly, I didn't feel it. So look for stuff that reduces incoming damage, anything that has damage reduction. The ranks of Blizzard are unnecessary. I just found it funny. Because when we look at Blizzard later, it will tell you, hey, we don't actually do that much damage with Blizzard. It's all ice spikes, baby. For the boots, you have two options. The smarter option is the Binding Embers boots. For one reason, because these boots have a reduction on your evade's cooldown whenever you attack. You can also get ranks in Teleport and Frost Nova, which is critical for keeping their cooldowns as low as possible. Get that move speed going, and I guess you want int for, instead of dodge chance, but I kind of like it. Oh, and Binding Embers lets you immobilize stuff while Flame Shield is active, which is good for applying more stun to things or just keeping them from chasing you. Of course, me being me, I also like using Asu's Heirloom from time to time. I mean, the problem with the boots, the ability is great. You increase your critical strike chance by your movement speed. Bonus, not the base movement speed. But the point is, the stats kind of suck. Like, evade granting movement speed after a dash is fine, but that's not really what you want. You want the cooldown thing if you want it to combo with Raiment, or just so that you can evade faster. Shrine buff duration is almost pointless. I guess it's just there to maximize the move speed you get from shrines, and slow duration reduction is pointless. More importantly, you do not get skills to teleport and to Frost Nova, which lowers their cooldown considerably, which is important. Because our mana comes from our cooldowns. I will explain that later. Actually, you probably know it. It's one of the ring aspects. I'll admit, weapon is weird. You want the plus vulnerable damage. You want the critical strike damage because, and I forgot to explain this later, ice spikes do count as something you cast, but they do not count as a skill. So if you're looking for ways to increase the damage of your ice spikes, that can crit, by the way. Look for things that say you deal extra damage, not your skill does extra damage, because it's not a skill. You'll be improving the damage of your Blizzard, which, sorry guys, Blizzard just isn't gonna do damage. It's the ice spikes, baby. If you see a 900 on the screen or like a 200, that's the Blizzard. It's not great. It is an ice spike delivery method. Anyway, look for crit strike, vulnerable. You don't need core because we don't have it. I just like having it there so I can use the wand in other builds, but go nuts, baby. Anyway, conceded. We deal more damage when we have a barrier active. Up next, Storm Swell. Ooh, yeah. That's not a great option, but that's the only Storm Swell I have, and it's been imprinted into the wrong focus. I have a much better focus than this because Life and Kill is pointless. But anyway, Storm Swell is terrible. We deal extra damage to vulnerable enemies while I have a barrier. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of ways to increase the Ice Spike's damage, so this will have to do, although it is the most replaceable aspect in our list. So if you want to put something else like, I don't know, the Ice Armor that adds more ice spikes and grants chill, you can, but this is fine. It is extra damage, and man, I cannot say no to more damage. Hey, wanna guess what aspect I've also never found? It's Prodigy, aspect of the Prodigy, which means using a cooldown restores our mana. I've never seen it drop. This is store-bought, not fresh. And for rings, you know what you need to roll on rings. It's crit strike, vulnerable damage, and question mark on the last one. Go with your heart. Maybe damage to frozen dudes, maybe damage to shield dudes. Coming up on the left, it's the aspect of the frozen tundra, which reads, doesn't matter. Your ice spikes have a 50% increased explosion radius. You don't care about the deep freeze one. We are not running deep freeze. Deep freeze is kind of awful. I mean, yes, it is a cooldown which can give us mana, but we have better cooldowns on our board for that. More utility cooldowns. By the way, I know I have damage to slowed enemies here, but that doesn't actually take into effect when we're running a Sorc. Because Chilled, which slows enemies, is not a slow, which means it doesn't count. Go ahead, try it out on a rogue. They have a dash improvement that allows them to daze slowed enemies if they are hit with a dash. It does not work. It is baffling. And of course, here is the Glacial aspect. I put it on the neck so that our extra damage is slightly improved. But man, do I want a better one. The good news is, even with a sacred Glacial aspect, you can punch up like 15, 14 levels. It's fine. You'll do fine. But it's not gonna be at its, highest potential. And I'm gonna rant about this a little bit. Here's the deal. You can pivot towards this build, but if you do not have this aspect, Blizzard is pointless. It does nothing. It chills a little. It needs 8 ticks to actually freeze. I died. To actually freeze somebody, which is not great. That takes a while. It's an ice shard delivery system. And without the previous aspect, the frozen tundra, we do have a problem with this build, and it's that the ice spikes explosions don't actually have a lot of range. You really need that extra range in frozen tundra to make this worth it. So while leveling this build, I heartily recommend that you start with like ice shards or something, because there's a little overlap there. But no, don't aim for this build until you get like a sacred glacial at the very least. Okay, up next, skills. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to talk about some of the stuff in the bar and the highly critical ones, as well as the enchantments. But if you want to know where the other skills are, link in the description, link in the comment. Okay, let's talk about the delivery system. Blizzard, its only job on this earth is to chill things, and I guess create ice spikes. So that's 2 jobs. And would you look at that damage though? 14,000 damage. Wow, that could be multiplied a lot, except Blizzard counts as an overtime ability, which means it cannot crit. It also does that damage over 8 seconds, which, as you can imagine, is it's not a lot. That's why it only has 1 point, because the damage doesn't matter, and increasing its points doesn't change the amount it can chill. We do want to invest in its modifiers to get to the other one, the one that gives it increased duration if cast above 50 mana, and you're gonna do that a lot. On our left click is the surprisingly good Ice Blades. It makes an Ice Blade for 6 seconds that walks around whacking people, and it has a chance to make them vulnerable. Great, its cooldown is reduced every time it hits a vulnerable enemy, which means you get more mana out of it whenever you cast it. Great, and if it has any cooldown reduction applied to it, 20% of that is applied to other skills. Also great. It's here for greater consistency on our vulnerable, because aside from Frost Nova, this is our only way of making a boss vulnerable. Not that it matters, because half the time, we don't really care what the boss is doing until it is stunned, because if it is not stunned / staggered, we're not gonna do a lot. Okay, if you've ever talked to a Sorc or ever watched a Sorc video, you know the rest of the bar, because this bar is pretty universal. That the bar is universal is problematic, yes, but I will discuss that in another video. For now, I'm just going to be happy talking about teleport. This is your escape, and if you're feeling particularly brave thanks to Raiment, this is your initiate. You teleport in, you Frost Nova everybody, and then get out. Unfortunately, points are very tight on this build, so I only put in like 1 point and points to get its modifiers, which include decreasing its cooldown per enemy hit, as well as getting damage reduction when you do teleport. This is also our smarter enchantment, because it changes your evade into a short-range teleport with a high cooldown. However, if you're wearing the boots that reduce evade cooldown when you attack, it's not a long cooldown at all. Best part, it's also a CC break. It makes you unstoppable. Much like Flame Shield does, except Flame Shield also makes you like immune, which means you cannot die. It also applies the burning aspect and lets you walk through stuff and makes you go faster and heals you for life. And it can be a good enchantment if you're playing on hardcore, because it automatically activates when you take fatal damage, although that can only happen every 2 minutes. It's worth it if you're playing on hardcore. If you are playing on softcore, like me, completely unnecessary. Don't bother putting it on your enchantments. But even in softcore, I prefer having this on my bar, because it is a get out of jail free card for when I screw up, and man, do I screw up a lot! While we have many ways of creating barrier, Ice Armor is our most consistent one. You also do not need to put more than 1 point into it, because you don't get a lot out of each point. You just need to put in 1 to activate it and 1 for the modifier, which increases your mana regen. And last but certainly not the least, Frost Nova, the best damn skill on the Sorc bar, which is unfortunate for many reasons that I'm not going to get into. It just freezes everybody around you, and if you kill things that Frost Nova has frozen, you reduce its cooldown, and it can make things vulnerable for a long time. 4 seconds for everybody else, 6 for bosses. There is a build out there that lets you spam Frozen Orb to get your vulnerability that way, but for the purpose of this build, unfortunately, this is the one to go for. Max it out, because you want its cooldown as low as possible. There are 2 skills we invest to that aren't on our board. Firebolt and Ice Shards, both of which have a place on our enchantment. I like ice shards when I'm speed farming things because it allows ice shards to automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. You don't need to put more than 1 point into it. And firebolt because it allows us to burn things with direct skills. Which, by the way, Blizzard does not burn things. It's not a direct damage skill. However, your little sword friend and your ice shards do. Teleport damage also counts, although the bonus we get from burning the things we activate with it, such as Devouring Blaze, which increases our critical strike damage against burning enemies. That's not super important against the average foe, but it is important against elites, and it is important against bosses. Okay, for defense, we've got Mana Shield, Protection, and Elemental Attunement. The Elemental Attunement lets us reset our defensive skills, even though it can only happen once every 10 seconds. It's still pretty good just to get our defenses up and running. As a side note, it also allows us to get more mana. Mana Shield, whenever we spend a lot of mana, 100 mana to be precise, you gain a 15% damage reduction, and we need all the damage reduction we can get because our life pool is tiny. Protection allows us to gain a barrier whenever you use a cooldown. So whenever you use any cooldown, you get a barrier and you get mana. For utility, we've got Cold Front. 2 points is fine because at 2 points, Blizzard freezes at, 8 ticks, which is fine. Adding another point and increasing our chill bones to 24 does not actually make Blizzard freeze faster, so 2 is fine. For offense, we've got Glass Cannon, which increases our damage but makes us take more damage in return. Permafrost, which allows us to deal a lot more damage to elites, but it's, now that I read it, is probably not as important because it's looking at skills, so no need to invest in that, I guess. But hey, it'll let me switch to ice shards faster. And Icy Touch, which allows us to deal more cold damage to vulnerable enemies. And Ice Spikes, I'm betting, are cold? Oh, and a Frigid Breeze, which allows us to gain more mana whenever we smack a vulnerable enemy. The Paragon board is also on the link below. I will discuss the nodes, but only if you listen to this rant, and it is, oh my god, the Paragon boards for Sorc are awful. Some glyphs don't work. And heaven help you if you're trying to do an Arclash build, which is what I started with. But then I realized literally none of the Paragon board legendary nodes matter to it. It is quite unbelievable that they've added a build to the game that has no support from half the leveling experience. Anyway, here's Icefall. When we kill a frozen enemy, gives us a barrier. Yay. Of course, we're going to be using the exploit glyph, which works a little differently for Sorcs because it doesn't actually let us apply vulnerable, it just increases our damage whenever we hurt a vulnerable enemy. Is it awful? Ugh, it's what we've got, okay? We've also got Winter, which allows us to deal more cold damage whenever we chill a guy. We've also got Destruction, which allows us to, guess what, deal more damage when we crit a guy. Control, of course, very welcome because it allows us to deal more damage to chilled or slowed enemies, or 20% more damage to frozen or stunned enemies. I'm not done building this yet, but it's here. It's Flame Feeder, allowing us to deal more damage to burning enemies. It does say direct damage, but I'm pretty sure our exploding ice spikes count as direct damage because I'm pretty sure if you can see through the nightmare that is happening on screen, it does actually set things on fire. Okay, last notes. Gameplay. There's 2 ways to play this. Number 1, the smart way. Let Blizzard do the work for you. Cast Blizzard, Ice Blades if you're feeling a little spicy, and walk away. Save your defensive cooldowns for use as intended. Defensively. Number 2, the awesome way. Cast your spells aggressively, teleport into them to pull them in with Raiment, and then freeze them all and then dodge out. See, if that feels cool. Aggressive use of Frost Nova also allows your enchantment Ice Shards to start shooting as quickly as possible, allowing you to deal a lot of numbers on the screen. With this method, the only time you walk away is when you're out of mana, because you're not doing anything. You don't have a basic skill. No mana, no Blizzard, dead Sorc. That all said, it's probably a mix of the two. You decide on what you're fighting. If you're going against a lot of serpents, you know, the guys with stuns, just hide. Don't jump into trouble. Save your cooldowns for when you need to break out of one of their stuns. If you're fighting cultists, who notably do not have a lot of CC in their kit. Why am I adjusting my audio? Anyway, go to town, be free. Against bosses, I like to put on teleport as my evade and just start teleporting onto bosses because it adds to their stagger bar. And it's neat. And for bosses, that's what you need to do to kill them. You need to stagger them. A lot of our abilities rely on applying stuff to the other guy, and bosses are immune. Not unstoppable, just, you know, immune to all forms of CC, including slow, chilled, whatever. The only thing you can apply to them, I believe, is damage over time effects such as poison and burning, and vulnerable. However, when they are staggered, they count as having all the status effects, which means all your damage goes online and they suddenly melt. So your goal is to survive until, you're knocked down and dizzy, and then let the blizzard do its work. So that's the build, Glacial Ice Spikes Blizzard. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, do all those nice things and more. And hey, ring that bell if you want to, because if you do, it'll help me out a lot. I am Patinator, and I will see you later.